So thank you all for coming, and let me thank Danny in particular for inviting me and arranging for me to be here, as well as that lovely, generous introduction. Cy Goodman, who I met at breakfast today and had a great talk about the program, and Michael Murphy, who's been handling much of the details that are necessary to make this possible.
And let me also thank
Bernie.
Which you didn't know, but made a lot of it.
Thank you. Yeah, we met on the way over. So my background is history. I'm a historian by training, who also has had a long-standing interest in economics. And over the past decade or so, a bit more than that, maybe 15 years, an interest in technology, and in particular information technologies. And so this is a part of a new project that I've sort of been playing with for the past few years on surveillance, and thinking about surveillance in various forms and guises that it takes in modern society, and then as a historian thinking historically, essentially how did we get here, and what can we learn by examining the past that has brought us to this current moment. So my talk today is the economics of surveillance, or really the strange economics of surveillance, as I hope to make clear why information does not always do what economic theory predicts that it would do. So a lot of this talk will be about some of the, well, darker, but also perhaps less obvious or unforeseen consequences of building a world through information and information technology. And I'm going to basically give you a story about one particular form that surveillance has taken after some preliminary remarks about the larger sort of theoretical and policy framework that the study of surveillance, or at least as I understand it, takes place in. In his 1948 paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, Bell Labs engineer Claude Shannon determined that information could best be understood as a transmission that reduced uncertainty and resolved ambiguous states. Everything else should be treated as either noise to be filtered out or a redundancy to the main signal. Shannon's idea was influential enough to enter popular culture in the 1950s and 60s. Designers Charles and Ray Eames gave it a puckish twist in their film, A Primer on Communication, where they pointed out that telling your lover you loved her had no informational value. Shannon had thus reduced diverse expressive forms such as letters and telegrams, or today email, as well as novels, plays, paintings, and sculptures to mere signals carrying messages. The semantic content of those messages was not his concern. By this way of thinking, there was no way to distinguish good information from bad information, truth from lies, democratic discourse from totalitarian propaganda, or slander, gossip, and emotional appeals from reason and knowledge. Much writing on information and the economy has followed the same line of thought. Information signals are presumed to move only in a positive direction, informing and enlightening the receiving parties. Information as an economic resource expands agent knowledge, removes uncertainty, increases transparency, and thus contributes to economic efficiency and innovation. But what if information creates unintended or unwanted consequences, bad results that make for inefficiencies or that stifle change and innovation? Now, I don't mean here the well-known problem of information overload, which could be resolved by better filtering mechanisms and the organizing of data. I mean that information itself may be a social bad as well as a social good. And this is my issue for today. If we shift our idiom from the neutral one of information to a more strategic language, then all sorts of new possibilities, problems, and potential conflicts of interest arise. Let's take, for example, information as surveillance. Surveillance is the creation and circulation of information, but it adds the connotations of power and control. Surveillance is a one-way rather than reciprocal act. Someone does surveillance on someone else with some intent or purpose in mind. It's not just the gathering of raw data, but the recording, organizing, classifying, and sorting of that data. Now, these are not neutral processes. There's no one best way to organize information, as librarians here could tell you. They reflect the needs and goals of the surveillors. Of course, the word surveillance immediately brings to mind the state, particularly the totalitarian state, as in George Orwell's novel 1984, Big Brother. But surveillance also has a market mode. It's the link in exchange relationships it's the link between exchange relationships and the means and method of enforcement, between contracts, compliance, and the regulation of agent behavior. Without surveillance, contracts are just pieces of paper filled with high-flown or obscure language. Without surveillance, trust is nothing more than a pure act of faith. The dependence of modern business transactions on surveillance thus makes the story much more complicated than in the case with the state and state surveillance. States impose surveillance with clear objectives in mind: capturing knowledge of citizens to build armies, gather taxes, regulate populations, or perhaps more benignly to improve public health. All require forms of surveillance of people's behavior and location. The agent of surveillance here is clear, but in the marketplace, no one agent wields sovereign power. Mixed motivations rather than clear objectives reign. Our reliance on surveillance in the marketplace is also a relatively new one. Now, people clearly have always watched and policed each other, but until about 200 years ago, they did so in face-to-face or in small communities. Only occasionally, as with conscription into the military, did the state even come to know much about its citizens, or more accurately, the king, his subjects. In the economic realm, most activity took place among people living side by side. Even long-distance trade depended on personal knowledge or affective contacts. For example, the religiously or ethnically based trade diasporas, or the small communities of merchants who met regularly in London's coffee houses in the 17th century. In modern society, by contrast, we trust people whom we do not know and may never meet. In extending connections beyond physical proximity, the tools of surveillance permit, in the classic formulation of Georges Simmel, a society of strangers. In other words, we know very little personal individual about our fellow citizens, so in place of that, we use lots of impersonal data. Surveillance in the marketplace is important to how the world functions, but it's far from the impartial process depicted in information theory. It operates through assemblages of technology that may interact in unexpected ways. It's continually inflected by unintended or incompletely foreseen outcomes. It functions in context shaped by politics, culture, and social relations. Now, for the rest of my talk, I want to bring this down to a more concrete level by looking at one of the most ubiquitous and powerful surveillance techniques of the modern economy: credit reporting. In economic theory, credit reporting is all about increasing transparency, establishing trust, regulating moral hazard, and disciplining opportunism. With better information, lenders more easily evaluate borrowers, permitting them to assess risk and lower the price of credit. Indeed, with true transparency, everyone wins. When all see all, competing lenders seek out the good risks, offering them favorable interest rates. And although the poor credit risks are segregated out, lenders can correctly price credit to them as well. Higher interest rates, but better than no credit at all. This compelling narrative portrays surveillance as offering up good information that eliminates strategizing. But what if people can strategize over information as much as any other economic resource? Credit reporting, in fact, has been a continual struggle over representation, or how people are seen in the credit mechanism, by what information, on whose terms. When practices that involve information like credit assessment work, they do so through conventions that deal with self-interest and strategizing over representation. Now, these conventions may be quite durable, though like any institution, if not properly maintained, they will break down. And like any institution, as they spread and become normalized and accepted practice, they cease to be questioned. We don't look inside them anymore. They start to take over the thinking for us. When this happens, and this is to anticipate my conclusion a little bit, when this happens, once they become normalized and accepted and unquestioned, it becomes possible again for actors to game the system, to engage in informational strategizing. In other words, in the ways of information, the evolution of new strategic viruses is always a possibility. So to understand this process, let me look at the evolution of consumer credit reporting and how it produced the FICO score. I'm sure you're all familiar with the FICO score, your credit score, which I will now sell back to you for a profit if you're interested. Today, almost all consumer credit surveillance is done by a mathematical algorithm based on statistical relationships between the behavior of the borrower and the likelihood of repayment. Now, the business credit market, I should note, is much less formalized than this, even though credit reporting in trade has a longer history than it does with consumers. Trade credit reporting has not devolved down to a single predictive scoring methodology, something I discuss in another paper. But today I want to tell the story of why scoring came to dominate the consumer market. Let me just note, though, with the contrast between consumer credit reporting and trade credit reporting, that in both cases the relevant causes and effects are the same. That is, they reflect the problems of information sharing and the aligning of interests and incentives over representation. Information markets like credit reporting are subject to the classic chicken and egg or network externality problem. Users of information will only subscribe to an information network if coverage is sufficient to make it useful to them. Sellers of information can only afford to collect the data if there's a clear market for selling it, including the ability to exclude non-payers. The subjects of surveillance need to be seen in order to obtain credit, but they resist too much of, or the wrong sort of, at least in their view, the wrong sort of surveillance that might cut off their financial lifeblood. Thus, the actors in this system have both divergent and convergent interests, resulting in a continual struggle over what constitutes valid information and how that information is represented. So the chicken and egg, meaning that you need people to buy into the system to make it worthwhile to sell the information, but people will only buy into the system if they believe it's widely accepted and useful. How do we overcome this problem, the problem of aligning interests and sharing information? Networks will only operate when incentives are carefully aligned to permit information to be shared among participants and accepted as legitimate by the subjects of surveillance. The market for consumer credit expanded in part because credit reporting there evolved such mechanisms. Credit to the consumer changed from a traditional form where lenders, such as tradesmen and storekeepers, only gave credit to those well known in their local community, now into a global system of instantly available, open line, revolving credit for almost any consumer purchase. Credit, in other words, shifted from face-to-face practice to a highly surveilled one. This change took place in a series of steps beginning in the 1920s. The 1920s were a consumer decade that saw widespread use of installment purchases, producer-provided loans, notably for automobiles, which became items of mass consumption in the 1920s, and vastly expanded use of credit in retail establishments, especially department stores. In all, by 1929, 20% of all retail sales were made on credit. Information serving the consumer credit market at first consisted of diverse forms of data assembled in a file constructing a life narrative. Investigators sought close familiarity with debtors. Chattel mortgage lenders, for example, took careful inventory of the homes of borrowers to record in detail the property securing the mortgage, making repossession easier should they default, and also to assess the character of the borrower in the most personal of settings. Since most people bought primarily from nearby merchants, thousands of local credit bureaus sprung up across the nation to collect and file this information, in addition to the in-house files kept in retailers' credit departments. As consumer credit data expanded in the 1920s, resellers were able to more closely track their customers. Department stores used coins, tokens, and charge cards that linked the purchase of each customer to the back of the house credit ledgers. Perhaps the most notable and effective of these tracking systems was the charger plate, first adopted by Filene's department store in 1929 and then spreading to other stores in the 1930s and 1940s. A metal square embossed with the customer's name, address, and account number, charge plates were run through a machine at the counter, automatically imprinting the identifying information on the sales slip. By filing the sales slips, the credit department was assured of an accurate report on the credit use at the individual level. Stores also overcame the self-interested inhibitions that normally would prevent them from sharing this data. The Boston Retail Trade Board designed a common plate with notches that would fit in the machines of each store. Board members agreed to treat each other equally so that one store did not use the commonality of credit to steal customers from another. The system also disciplined free riding by mandating that each time a customer opened a new account, that store would conduct an independent investigation of credit worthiness to be shared with the other members. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. You got a little thing to put it in so it didn't, I guess, make a hole in your pocket when you put it down. Charge plates and related practices overcame the chicken and egg problem of credit reporting. Stores were willing to share information because their customers were part of a single monitoring network. Customers had incentive to join this network because it was simple and convenient to use the same charge plate in multiple locations. The shared data was also sufficiently rich that stores could capture the behavioral patterns of their customers, enabling them to construct basic ratings of credit worthiness. And this is the little thing you got, right? So that each charge plate, notice it's useful in a number of different locations. And in fact, actually, if you look up here, you can even see the notches on the charge plate where it would go into the machine that you were authorized, the store that you were authorized to have credit with. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, stores became especially concerned about maintaining their control of credit. At the same time, customers became more dependent on credit for purchases than ever before. By 1938, credit sales had risen to 25% of all retail. Department stores thus expanded their cooperative information system to cast a wider net. For this, they relied on the thousands of independent credit bureaus located in towns and cities across the nation. Credit bureaus performed the labor-intensive work of gathering information and maintaining and updating files. Files which included information on the individual's purchases and credit routines, as well as details of identity and lifestyle, race, marital or divorce status, drinking habits. Though highly localized, the credit bureaus exchanged their data since each of them served a home market and did not compete outside of that territory. Meanwhile, retailers, wary about sharing customer information that could fall into the hands of a competitor, were willing to cooperate through the independent credit bureaus, which in turn maintained a national network through their trade association, the Associated Credit Bureaus of America. It was a system that gave credence to the trade association's motto, "Your credit bureau follows you like a shadow." Through the 1950s, consumer credit depended on this highly diverse yet interconnected system of information collection and sharing. Over the next 30 years, that would change into a single method of standardized data feeding into a predictive score. Well, why did this happen? The idea of using statistics in predictive fashion for credit was actually not that new. In the early 1950s, credit managers and professionals recognized the potential of shifting their monitoring from character to behavior, or as they put it, from what a man is to what a man does. What they needed, however, was a method of gathering the data which depended heavily on cooperation and sharing among the different parties. The first part of this new system came when consumer credit swung from open book to revolving credit. Now, store charge plates were not true credit cards. They were monitoring devices that linked the customer to a line of credit sent monthly under the stern gaze of the store credit manager. Accounts were to be paid off each month. In the late 1950s, however, banks, sensing that consumer credit was now a profitable and safe market, developed the first open-line revolving credit cards, gradually supplanting store-based credit. Revolving credit from universal cards severed the old link between information and credit and required a new system of information sharing and exchange. As with the earlier credit system, the credit card confronted a chicken and egg dilemma. Retailers would only begin to accept credit cards if they were popular and in general use. but customers would only sign up for cards if they were widely accepted by retailers. Credit cards had advantages to stores, particularly small stores, since they eliminated most of the record-keeping, financing, and monitoring costs associated with store-based credit. But in outsourcing credit, retailers lost control of the credit monitoring function and hence the ability to control risk and promote sales. Given how much retail merchants had invested in gaining this control and insight into their credit customers, the bank-issued cards had to come with some inducements. One inducement was protection against loss or fraud by card users. That is, the store wouldn't be liable if a fraudulent card was used to buy something, the bank would absorb the loss. Another was data on sales and purchases by their customers. Well, those inducements took care of the chicken, but what of the egg? The answer: mass mailing. In 1957, Bank of America introduced the Bank Americard by sending it to some 60,000 California customers and foregoing the usual credit checks. It worked. The card gained wide acceptance by merchants and customers both. Nonetheless, Bank of America had to sustain heavy losses in the early years, and other banks moved cautiously to follow the leader. When Chase Manhattan Bank unveiled its charge card a few years later, it steered clear of the mass mailings and screened customers the traditional way. As a result, it failed to convince merchants to accept the card. The divergent experience of the two pioneering banks showed that credit cards would work only if one moved aggressively in signing up customers and merchants. But to do so, banks needed an effective system of credit monitoring and fraud control. The capacity to monitor credit continuously was key. Bank of America had designed its credit card strategy following the installation of its IRMA, E-R-M-A, or Electronic Recording Method of Accounting system a few years before to speed check processing and account balancing. By 1957, IRMA and related information technology investments yielded more sophisticated databases that could connect different forms of information to paint a composite picture of the borrower. As credit cards spread outside of a single bank customer base, some means was needed to track customers across regions and among different financial institutions. This too required a new form of information sharing. The consumer market already had a means of credit information sharing through retailer cooperation and credit bureaus. When Sears Roebuck computerized its accounting systems in the 1950s, for example, the Trade Credit Association provided assistance to independent bureaus in accessing this data, obtaining the monthly computer tapes, and distributing them to members after converting their various ledger setups into a single format. In the 1960s, the small, scattered local credit bureaus also began to merge, creating larger databases of information on consumers. The larger credit bureaus adopted computer and electronic data processing, which aligned their information structure with that of the banks, so that information could be shared by exchanging computer tapes. Especially important in the credit card business was the entry of new actors from the electronics industry in the 1960s. Taking advantage of electronic processing power, they designed credit verification systems that allowed merchants to query charges in real time, which meant that credit cards could be used securely for store purchases with little waiting. By 1964, a credit transaction could be confirmed or denied within 90 seconds. In 1969, TRW acquired Credit Data. Credit Data had started in the 1930s as the Michigan Credit Association, but it had also been a pioneer in the shift from manual to computerized methods in the 1960s. TRW completed this process, operating a large mainframe in Anaheim, California, with 50 million names, selling credit profiles to request on lenders. But those who availed themselves of TRW's credit reporting service were also required to share their data on customers and borrowers. In other cases, independent credit bureaus and regional systems managed the shift to new methods and technologies, notably Retail Credit Company of Georgia, which transformed itself into Equifax. Computerized credit bureaus by the 1960s had clearly moved credit reporting through consolidation and the sharing of information in large computer data banks. And of course, this is the structure that pretty much evolved today, although believe some of them have changed their names at this point. I can't keep track of what they're called anymore. But the big three had emerged by the 1970s, dominating the computerized data bank form of consumer credit reporting. Financial institutions had initially set up their credit card approval and authorization systems to cover their own customers. But by 1966, two nationwide card associations were in operation: National Bank of Americard Incorporated, or NBI, and Interbank Card Association. NBI in 1976 changed its name to Visa. Interbank, as you could imagine, evolved into MasterCard. But their most important early achievement was in information sharing, allowing the construction of a rapid nationwide verification system while also accumulating vast panels of data that helped underwrite credit marketing. By the mid-1970s, with information on consumer credit standardized and centralized in this way, it became easier for credit reporting to be done with quantitative data and probability-based algorithms, those that had been first outlined theoretically in the 1950s. Before we get to FICO, however, one final factor should be noted in this shift: politics, particularly the politics of representation. Let's remember my original point that surveillance in the marketplace always involves a struggle over the questions of how people are represented. And in the case of credit card and related consumer credit reporting, this was no less true. In the 19th century, credit reporting had to walk a fine line between collecting data for lender clients and protecting the confidentiality of information that could be potentially damaging to borrowers. Indeed, this was one reason that business credit reporting was much less standardized and used much less shared data than did consumer credit: fear of running afoul of the law and being sued because a credit report had caused a business to fail. In the 20th century, however, the politics of credit shifted. Politics and the law pushed consumer credit in nearly the opposite direction as law had affected trade credit, putting a premium on wide availability, sharing, and standardization. Reacting to charges that individuals were denied credit based on innuendo, hearsay, and lifestyle choices that were irrelevant to risk, Congress passed the Fair Credit Reporting Act in 1970. This act required reporting agencies to maintain accurate files, purge unverifiable information, and permit credit seekers to examine and correct their records. In 1974, responding to pressure by women's rights organizations, Congress added the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which forbade credit discrimination on the basis of sex or marital status, undercutting the long-standing tradition of rating women for credit lower than men. The act also banned the use of certain categories pertaining to race and ethnic status. And finally, in 1976, Congress opened hearings on information privacy in the private sector. Well, the upshot of all this legislation and these investigations was to make computer data banks and behavioral or transactional information, not what a man is, but what a man does, or not what a woman is, but what a woman does, the answer to concerns about privacy and prejudice. If women or African Americans were denied credit because credit evaluators took race or marital status or personal lifestyle into account, well then credit scoring based strictly on patterns of credit use and behavior provided a defense against charges of discrimination. If the variable records kept on individuals by thousands of small credit bureaus were considered unsecure and liable to misuse, then highly standardized data available only to those with authorized access, overseen by a small number of large corporate entities, provided greater security and superior accuracy. Fairness would arise by processing more information more cheaply for more people to lower the cost of credit to the poor and to minorities while increasing transparency to protect the borrower. All of these outcomes, it was argued, required the shift to new high-powered computerized credit reporting systems and the move to quantifiable standardized forms of information to what looked like an objective credit score. And thus we get to the FICO moment, which I think you'll see is actually the tail rather than the dog of the story. It's the outcome, it's not the causal force. It was the availability of standardized data that enabled the Fair Isaac Company to develop a credit scoring methodology. You probably know FICO is just Fair Isaac Company name, FICO. At first, this required a labor-intensive process of sorting through the records and ledgers of an individual company. But as more data became available in digital form, the cost of the data input fell and the scoring models developed. The FICO score also fit the political and legal temper of the times, based as it was on behavior rather than on observed characteristics. So to its supporters, the credit score revealed much more about the credit worthiness and risk that had been, to its supporters, the credit score revealed much about the credit worthiness and risk that had been hidden by partial information and rule of thumb guesswork. But this vast abstraction also concealed its own ignorance behind a veil of data. Indeed, the FICO score worked in part because it was a proprietary formula that used a common data platform but could be sold for a profit. In this way, it aligned the interests and incentives in the market for information. It eliminated the danger of strategizing by competing lenders. It represented consumers in a way that accorded with legal and political mandates, and it earned sellers of information a profit. It did these things by means of a black box, an institutional arrangement that took over the thinking about risk and credit. And as a black box, it was subject to the laws of unintended outcomes and unexpected consequences. In the 1990s, general acceptance of the FICO score led federal and private lenders to use it for mortgages as well. With credit ratings attached to individual mortgages, bond rating agencies were then able to score packages of asset-backed securities. Indeed, without FICO, Standard & Poor's and the other bond raters would have lacked a methodology to rate individual mortgages comprising the tranches of debt obligations. Reduction of complex individual data into a single universally recognized score made securitization of mortgages easier. But it was a method that was only valid to the extent that past behavior predicted future behavior, based as it was on shallow information compressed into the FICO score. It worked best when conditions in the future were very much like those of the past. It became unstable in the face of sudden changes in conditions or behavior. The history, and indeed the assumptions behind the history and the limitations of FICO, were either lost or ignored. The consequences of ignoring that history, well, we're living through them today. So let me conclude. In theory, information is subject to the same laws of supply and demand as is every other commodity. At some point, the cost of knowing outweighs the value of what is known, a sort of equilibrium state. But historically, forces have conspired to change this calculus. Now, some of this is technological, reduction in the cost of gathering, holding, sorting, and deploying information. Some of it's political, the uses of information to serve certain social ends. Much of it is institutional. Information is a strategic resource, and how and where it's provided depends not on the efficiency of markets, but on the interests of actors and the ability of entrepreneurs to align, or more precisely, to serve certain interests and generate a profit. The externalities of too much information, not enough privacy, or even unforeseen disasters, these are not their concerns. The danger is that as we gather ever larger quantities of information, we create black boxes that we no longer question or interrogate. The tendency is inherent in the process of acquiring information for use, or what I have termed surveillance. We see, we observe, we sense all sorts of things all of the time, but of this, little is remembered, and what is remembered, little is used. No matter how delicate the sensory mechanism, no matter how powerful the information processing software, it is impossible to eliminate the opportunity cost of attention. Beyond a certain point, there are simply too many things to pay attention to, and here's where black boxes operate. They impose an order, a grid, or a classification scheme that tells us what is interesting and what is irrelevant. Surveillance operates by calling attention to some things while ignoring others. But this is also why surveillance can never yield simple transparency, the way in which the economic theory of information would predict. Or rather, why transparency, a purely instrumental value, should never be mistaken for knowledge. Nearly a century ago, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead identified the fallacy of transparency. There is a danger in clarity, he wrote, the danger of overlooking the subtleties of truth. More recently, sociologist Charles Perrow has called attention to the inherent opacity of complex systems and black boxes. No matter how well designed, such systems will fail predictably, but at unpredictable moments, what he termed normal accidents. The slow but steady spread of the FICO score is an example of a normal accident at work. The response to such breakdowns is frequently to assume that more information will solve the informational problem. If the mortgage market collapses through vendor opportunism, or if companies like Enron hide their operations behind a thicket of misinformation, then we automatically assume greater surveillance and accountability are called for. But by enabling further surveillance, such a response creates opportunities down the road for yet more strategic information behavior. My argument, in short, is that the economic logic is for surveillance to grow even when it fails to produce the results that it was intended for. By this process, we are creating a world where information draws more people into an ever tighter grid, not due to a totalitarian state, but by the logic that says information makes for transparency, and transparency promotes efficiency and exchange. Beneath the surface, this information creep may be having debilitating consequences. Critic Philip Agre has argued that too much information drawing people too close together stifles economically valuable diversity. Diversity thrives whenever behavior and action do not have to be explained and accounted for immediately. Exactly the opposite of information and surveillance systems that try to control or regulate behavior by means of accountability and statistical regularity. And you can think of an example from the case I just gave you, the way in which the FICO score induces a form of personal self-editing so that you can engage in the sort of behaviors and be the sort of person that then has a higher FICO score. Deep diversity, biologists note, requires independent and unrelated evolution, the sort of a diversity that arises in distinct environments without contact with each other. The creative possibilities with this sort of Galapagos isolation, Galapagos referring to the Galapagos Islands where Darwin first developed his theory of evolution, the creativity possible with this sort of Galapagos isolation, Tim Harford argues, is being undercut by nervous corporate hierarchies that are unable to innovate, stifled by the very information that identifies each potential risk and demands that every outcome have a clear, accountable, measurable result, preferably sooner rather than later. Too much standardization, too many protocols reduce the variety of contexts, wiping out the cultural niches and recesses where diversity and creativity can occur. Futile attempts at complete information, total transparency, or full calculability and accountability may only cut down the sort of rich, embedded life that makes for creative innovation and change, while making inevitable the sort of system breakdowns and strategic opportunities that are entirely to be expected in a world awash in too much information. Thank you.
I know that some of you will probably have to leave in about 10 or so minutes. So what I suggest is take 2 questions at a time, and we'll convene further.
Right, and answer the easier one.
Yes. So John will be really.
I thought your discussion of the credit revolution of the 1920s was fascinating. I didn't know that. Did that development track the development, economic development of the other advanced capitalist countries in Europe or Canada?
Good question.
Or was it was the United States leading the way? And if so, why?
Right.
What was it about American capitalism that led
Well,
to that?
big question. I'm supposed to take 2, so you'll have to. Yes, please.
You mentioned that at first, when the credit reporting system was coming on, it was more of tracking who the person is rather than their behavior, and then it led to the second form. It seems like with the kind of information that we're gathering today from social media, whatnot, it's going to be, again,
Bingo.
what the person is. Is there something out there in the system that stops it, maybe the Fair Credit Act or the economy itself?
Right. Perfect question. I mean, I thought exactly of that while I was reading something on the plane coming over. So yes, you know, there's a great story which I start out another version of this paper with, about a couple that were applying for a mortgage, and this was at the sort of bottom of the, of the financial crisis. So lenders were very, very wary, and they were actually asked to provide a sort of narrative history of why did they want, it's very old-fashioned sort of, why do you want a mortgage anyway, young man? So right, I mean, I think the answer is that the instability of these kinds of algorithmic quantitative methods does the sort of uncertainty that's inherent, I think, in trying to, you never have perfect information. What matters, what doesn't matter? Well, it depends. What if the context shifts? All that good FICO stuff might become irrelevant. So there's always this sort of nervous logic about gathering more and more information. I don't think the Fair Credit Reporting Acts and related things necessarily provide much of a barrier, because remember, they were sort of intended, right, to regularize what type of information. Now, clearly, if they thought you were discriminating on the basis of gender or race, you probably would be, run afoul of it. But one problem is, one problem that developed almost immediately was that, lots of things are correlated with undesirable, like zip codes, right? And so you can collect zip code information. They actually did sort of have an addendum to limit use of zip code. But it just happens that the zip code that you don't want people to get, you won't want to give credit to people with is 90%, minority or something. And so this is a continual problem, right? So I don't think that actually the laws would do much. To your question, I mean, big question. First of all, I don't know as much about other places, but I do know that in general, credit reporting was less developed. And I think in general also, America has always been sort of at the forefront. I mean, there may be some other countries, but compared to, say, the main European nations, America has always been sort of at the forefront of consumer credit, right? I mean, that's the knock against American-style capitalism. We're such a credit-driven system.
Is that a result of government policy?
Sorry?
Is it a result of government policy?
Well, I mean, not in the 1920s, certainly, right? I mean, that really is driven by businesses, right? Automobile makers are trying to find a way to deal with the cost of durable, right? There's an argument in the 1960s and 70s that some of those, the Fair Credit Acts, they are kind of designed to get credit into the hands of people who don't have them. And there's actually a very good recent book by Louis Hyman on the history of debt and credit in America called Debtor Nation. He actually spells this argument out pretty well about how there was a kind of presumption that one way to address poverty or one way to address prejudice was make credit more democratic, right? It's a big assumption. But that's, I think, the only moment. I mean, I think a lot of it has more to do with the business sector trying to figure out ways to sell products.
If the FICO stuff is used in Europe and I'll believe it's the EU right now, but if you move from Europe to the US, you don't have any credit anymore.
Oh, interesting.
Is that because of policy or issues, or because they don't use the same system?
That I don't know. I didn't realize that, actually. So
You start over.
you start over. So none of your experience.
You move to a different country. You start over.
In Europe, yeah.
Even in the US, you move from
US to
here, you start over.
So, I mean, that's very interesting. I didn't know that. But like the logical way of thinking about that is, okay, what we need to do is to integrate these systems even better, right? We need to have a universal credit score that will follow you anywhere you go.
I was just wondering the policy, like EU has a lot of policies on stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I don't know whether this is a policy-driven thing or not, but privacy issues vary widely, right, and in odd ways, right? So France can actually be very strong about protecting data privacy, whereas a country you might think would be like Sweden actually has very open, right? They believe, well, we're all part of the same society. Why shouldn't we share? We have to promote credit, or we have to promote social programs. We want lots of information. So it might just be aligning different. I mean, there are wide variations in laws, and that might be as much as anything that affects it. But I'm not quite sure why going from Europe to the United States is an issue.
So at the end of your talk, if I heard correctly, it sounded like you basically outlined two major problems that this credit reporting system, the FICO score, has created. And
right.
One is the very prosaic and sort of just natural problem, which is when you define the areas of interest, you create new areas for people, for malfeasance.
Right.
So
Strategizing.
Strategizing. I like my word. But so you have more opportunities for strategizing. But then the other problem you outline is how people shape their behaviors, perhaps in a homogenizing and therefore detrimental to creativity and innovation way.
Right.
Which of these two problems do you see as being the most significant, and why, and what sort of options do we have? Because every solution we've said thus far is to perpetuate, if you solve one problem, you aggravate the other.
Right, right. Do you want me to take another, Steve?
So mine sort of follows on this.
Good.
It seems at the end of your paper that you're suggesting that the financial problem in the lending market for real estate was an information problem rather than just a lowering of the standards.
Yeah.
So was it really?
Ah.
Was it really evidence that there was a breakdown?
But you can't really separate the two, right? Right? Because your standards are partly determined by how you evaluate information. No? I mean,
I can separate the two in my mind.
Can you?
My explanation would be that they didn't, they just changed the standards.
Yeah, yeah.
Who qualified?
Yeah. Right, but
We have
right.
information
But your your standards for credit are, I think this is a roundabout way of getting to your question, but I'll take it on more directly if I can. So the standards for credit, right, are determined by, okay, some sense of being able to predict what you're going to do if I give you credit, right? So partly my sense of what I can predict is dependent on how much faith I have in my methodology and my system of information, how much information, how much faith I have in it. So, I mean, I don't have an answer. It could be that, like the most cynical interpretation would be that all of this credit reporting doodah was, kind of fig leaf to cover just, the same way that that investment bankers, right, employed all these ex-physicists to do quantitative analysis to justify, right, that one way of reading that, it was just basically a way of covering up what you're saying, malfeasance or lowering of standards because they just saw an opportunity to make money, and that all this kind of quantification has mostly a PR type. I think that's probably a little too cynical. The other way would be to say that they believe their own BS. They really believed we've got it all figured out, we know what we're doing, we're so precise with our measurements that we can now go into these lesser credit markets because we have good ways of preventing fraud, right? I mean, it's only one part of the story because there's obviously a lot of other things going on. But do you want me to take reply? Yeah. What was the question?
So basically, the gist is at the end you outlined that you, in order to deal with it, you need to collect more information. But collecting more information will have the chilling effect on creativity and diversity.
Right. So there are two things. One is what Steve was getting at, right? Which is that you often end up with these black boxes that you're overconfident in, or perhaps even just become an opportunity for people to pretend they know what they're doing, so they can, lower the standards or whatever. The other is more what you're saying, right? It's like we become obsessed with measuring everything. I think that most of the emphasis, and if most of you work at a university, you've probably experienced this firsthand, right? The endless attempt of self-measurement and accountability, I think, is the danger that's not discussed. I don't know if it's the greater danger, but it's not the one that's in the zeitgeist, right? It's not, everyone's about, we need more transparency and accountability, and it's sort of like taken as though there is no potential negative consequences to that. So I would say that I guess my role is to bring to the fore the downside of endlessly trying to measure and account for everything. But I don't know which is worse. I mean it is, as you say, it is a trade-off. So yes.
I think just making a point. There's no more inherent morality in the informational method than there is the good old one.
True.
It can still be used for the wrong purposes,
Mm-hmm.
the wrong way.
I would agree.
It's just more justifiable in some ways because of all the information.
Right.
And we all know that there was lots of immoral behavior in TARP, bailout, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. No, I would agree. In fact, I would totally say that information is basically, bottom line, is not neutral in the way people think of it as being neutral.
So I guess you could draw a conclusion from the paper that information is not substitute for judgment.
Yeah, I mean, it raises the question, like you're saying, right? What did people do before they had this ability to endlessly gather information? And I mean, some of it was what we would have trouble accepting, right? Making decisions on the basis of things that we think are kind of illegitimate, to make decisions on. But on the other hand, right? I mean, the type of, the belief you can kind of measure and control everything, I think, is the first fallacy, right? Right. I mean,
think about your venture capital community.
Yeah.
They use that. They use this kind of model. They've never invested.
Right. I mean, investment bankers apparently do a lot of the same thing, despite all the quantitative analysis and all the ex-physicists. It's still very much a relationship type of business. But again, it kind of raises the question. Well, all of human history from until 50 years ago was like that. Now, lots of horrible things happened in history, and lots of prejudice and all kinds of other things were part of that system. But I mean, societies have run without trying to become information obsessed. Or you could say that is that what's promoted our well-being, the fact that we are so good at information? I don't know. I mean, that's.
Seems to me that all of those people occupying all of those squares are making a pretty strong statement about who it benefited.
Yeah.
And what the end result is.
At the very least, if we're going to base much of what we do in the corporate world or the market world or the political world on the idea of information will solve all of our problems, we should have a kind of sensitivity and awareness to the, what that means. In other words, to open the black box, or to get away from the sort of Claude Shannon notion that information is this, neutral process of receiving signals that direct your behavior, and recognize that information is as much a cultural product as anything else that we make.
Having experienced a lot of it firsthand, I was really interested recently. We were really interested to watch how long it took the banks to learn how they could make money off of the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, I had a first mortgage bank calling me, talking to me about foreclosure, while the second mortgage, different bank, although
Trying to lend you more money.
was calling me, trying to get me to pay a little bit more in order to keep myself current, keep myself under 90 days behind.
Yeah.
And I'm like, do you two even talk to each
No.
other? And
Well-
it was Wachovia and those partners.
Right. Steve?
One of the things I was curious about, but I'm not sure whether you mentioned it or not, is that it seems to me there was a dynamic going on at the moment when they're getting tremendously more computing power, in which you could say that the accuracy of an individual credit report matters less.
Right.
Because the pool,
Totally.
pool is larger.
Right. Absolutely.
Just one, and that basically we will just have a lot of mistakes.
Have a lot of mistakes.
That is such large number.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely part of what's going on. Yeah.
Some of that is that we've learned that you actually can reach a level where that's been
Right.
dangerous.
Right.
Then I would wonder if that's true, is there evidence that there are banks that are basically trying to produce an alternative source of this information? Rather than buying into the large pool,
Right.
we see evidence of them saying, there's too much cheating of this standard score.
Right.
We're going to look to other measures.
Well,
You would expect that.
to happen. So, the first point, which in the longer paper I do discuss that as part of the development of the methodology. Bear in mind that insurance companies had discovered how to do that, 50, 100 years before, right? They discovered you could have statistically based risk. So actually the complement, if we want to do the full history of this, I should give you a whole paper on the history of insurance as well. But the other thing is, I think right now the answer is that they don't have good alternatives. That's, I think, the upshot of that little article in the New York Times about 4 years ago about the bank, just tell us they were trying to get back to some notion of character. Maybe social media is a way that they will do that. But also, they're just not lending, right? You just basically, that's the danger of abandoning the system, is when you have nothing to really replace it with that is, accepted, legitimate to all parties, right? Then you do have a kind of information freeze. And I think that's kind of the moment we're in right now. Right?
So Thank you.
Oh,
One
my pleasure.
last
It
question.
seems to
Sorry.
me that your black box is not really a black box. I mean, they must have changed the algorithm as they went along.
Yeah.
Based on these judgments.
Right.
We say circa 2006, when you had a guy with $25,000 income
Yeah.
buying a $200,000 house, and you turn the number, plug the numbers in,
Right.
and return it. There's something must have been that changed to say, go ahead and lend it to
Yeah. Well, bear in mind that the FICO score was not used so much to make choices about individuals borrowing, but to rank the mortgages in the collateral, so that you have the A, B, C tranches. So the idea wasn't they didn't know that some of the lending was higher risk. It's that they believed that they had a good handle on what was a low risk, medium risk, and high risk. They could package them together, and then, well, that gets into the financial stuff. That's not really my area. But it was the idea that not so much that they didn't know, but that they believed that they understood what the numbers meant and how they could use them. And the black boxing, it's not that Fair Isaac doesn't know what's inside the box. It's that the other actors in the system treat it like a black box, and they don't have any penetration into it to know what they're using it for.
So, Ken, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
my pleasure. Thank you.